Brace yourself.
This video is going to be a little different than what you're used to seeing from me. I'm not going to be talking about game design this time around. I want to talk about something much more personal to me. It's something I've wanted to discuss more thoroughly for a long time now, so I thought now is as good a time as any to share this. When I was in high school, I was diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder. In case you don't know, obsessive compulsive disorder is a mental illness where a person experiences intrusive thoughts and is mentally compelled to act in certain ways, usually in repetitious or, yes, obsessive ways. For me, it was a long time coming. It was after months of constantly washing my hands, fearing contamination and contaminating others, despite having clean and safe habits. I would wash my hands upwards to 5 times in a row and would refuse to touch things like doorknobs, books, and pencils. Because of the washing, my hands would be red and raw, becoming dry and irritated after the water evaporated. At night, I'd need to repeat the same reassuring sentences to myself hundreds of times solely to clear my head and get me to relax. It was a nightmare, and it was causing a lot of stress on me and my family. It took a lot of courage to admit that I needed help, but it was something I ultimately had to come to terms with. It really shook me when I realized that it was impeding on everything going on in my life, but it was my mother who got me to admit that I needed to get this under control. I feel lucky in retrospect. My mom was in the best possible position to understand my condition. My mother's job is in social counseling, so she recognized my symptoms despite my initial denial. I talked to my primary care physician, who directed me to a mental health doctor, and after a thorough diagnosis, the doctor determined that I had obsessive compulsive disorder. The next year was one of repeated treatments to see what could keep my OCD under control, but I was eventually prescribed drugs that, when combined with some reassessment of daily routines, were able to get my life back on track. After high school, I considered myself fully treated, eventually weaning myself off of the drug. Still, I live with OCD every day. The difference now is that I can control it and keep it from being a constant interference with what I do throughout the day. I told the story of my recovery in more detail in an article I submitted to Take This, a video game-themed charity used to support gamers living with mental illness. I'll put a link in the description so you can read it at your leisure if you feel. But my main point of this video is showing how OCD has affected me as a gamer. I've seen many videos on how gamers have coped with anxiety, depression, or bipolar disorder through video games, but I haven't heard much discussion regarding obsessive compulsive disorder. I'm not sure if this is because it's a rare condition in the community, or if folks think there just isn't much to talk about with it, but I wanted to share my own experiences. So before I go into how this applies to gaming, I need to say that if you have any concern that you might have a mental illness, please see a medical professional. Your doctor will help you get proper diagnosis and treatment. Mental health, like any health, needs to be addressed with a doctor. It's not something you can self-diagnose, so for your safety and well-being, be sure to talk with your doctor if you're concerned. So like many other mental illnesses like depression, anxiety, and even some like post-traumatic stress disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder doesn't affect diagnoses in the same ways. Different people with OCD express their symptoms differently, just like with any other mental illness. You might think that one of the most common representations of OCD is completionism. Someone might feel compelled to finish a game to 100% to satisfy a personal desire to entirely explore a game. Or maybe the symptom is checking every single spot on a map or open every single chest in a dungeon. These are pretty safe assumptions, and I'd be lying if I said there isn't anybody with OCD who expresses these types of behaviors. But my OCD is expressed in some unorthodox ways, at least in my own opinion. For me, the basic routines are pretty well supported. One act I still do is repeatedly check my save files. I will go back into a save point and make sure that my progress was logged away right, even if I just saved a minute or so ago. This is one of my earliest symptoms of OCD in my games, as I'd always have to check to make sure certain save files were preserved in any case where I would have to overwrite one. 100% complete files would get repeated checks as well. However, there is another OCD symptom I've expressed, one I didn't discover until just recently. It regards difficulty. Here's a conversation I had near the end of last year. I really love Bloodborne. It's one of my favorite games of 2015. Yeah? What did you think of the final boss? I haven't finished it yet. How far are you? I just beat the second boss. So let me add some context to this exchange. I have an odd relationship with game difficulty. While I do like a good challenge, I have experienced my share of roadblocks. In the case of games like Bloodborne, I am confident enough in my skills to be able to play them. However, there were multiple times throughout my sessions where I reached a boss that gave me trouble. Father Gascoigne is probably the most notable example of this, as far as what I've played. Upon reaching a difficult boss like Gascoigne, I find myself dying over and over, and with each death I become increasingly obsessed with beating the boss. I don't like being stuck, and rage quitting is something I consider quite shameful, so I keep playing. No matter how long it takes, I'm compelled to beat the boss, and if I stop playing, I continue to think about this boss. It bothers me, and that's my OCD at work. But it's not limited to just being stuck. In fact, it goes in the reverse as well. Once I beat Gascoigne, I was very relieved. I saved and set the game aside for a while. There was no longer a roadblock impeding my progress, so I felt I could pick up the game at any time afterward, all with a new path and goal in front of me. But the odd thing is this, I didn't pick the game up again, not for a long time. I was at a fresh position where I could continue without worrying about a roadblock, but I wanted to stay in that comfort zone as long as possible. On super difficult games, I always want to end a session of play on a good note, without any obstacle in my way that would impede my path. So in the case of Bloodborne, I disappear from the game for a long time. I'm in that perfect place to pick the game up again, yet I don't for a long while. So it's the combination of obsessively trying to beat a very difficult obstacle until it's beaten, and then to preserve that moment of being able to start and move forward at my leisure. I stay there as long as possible. So I stop playing the game, fearing I'll eventually reach another point where I get stuck and can't complete part of the game. This is why I think Bloodborne is a very fun game, but also why I say that without having barely touched the game. I like playing it and enjoy what it has to offer, but I worry that I'll get to a point where the intrusive thought of being stuck will appear and never dissipate. This sounds very troublesome, but it's by no means the worst situation I've experienced with difficulty and my OCD. There was one other case, a game that was far, far worse for me. Downwell is the most miserable I've ever been with a video game. There isn't a single game I've played in my life that's brought this level of agony and unhappiness to me, and I say that without any hyperbole. Now don't mistake this as Downwell is the worst game I've ever played, because that's not true. I've played worse games, but Downwell is certainly the most unhappy I've been while playing a game. Downwell was originally going to be used for a review video on my channel, but I quickly reached a roadblock, the same roadblock that cut my time in Bloodborne short. Downwell is difficult, thanks in no small part to its roguelike item upgrade system, but I was steadily able to get past the worlds with practice. Bit by bit, I continued, and after hours and hours of playtime, I reached the final boss. But I was quickly left with defeat, and was kicked back to the very first level with every single death. Eventually, the fatigue of having to replay levels over and over again got to me, along with randomly distributed upgrades that were too unbalanced to be worth so many do-overs. This went on for hours and hours, and every time I actually got to the final boss again, it was a fast end. So Downwell broke me. I gave up. I rage quit and didn't touch Downwell again. I uninstalled it, but I still saw the name in my library. I couldn't bear to delete it permanently, but I was still haunted by the name in my Steam library and YouTube videos others posted online. Every time Downwell was mentioned anywhere to me, it was a reminder that I couldn't beat it. It was a reminder of my failure. This was my OCD communicating to me. It was the same feeling I felt when I couldn't beat a boss in Bloodborne, but it was so much worse. So months after giving up, I threw caution to the wind and tried to beat Downwell again. I kept trying and kept failing. So after a very late night of playing it and a mere 3 hours of sleep early one Saturday morning, I played Downwell one more time, and I actually finished it. I was able to overcome this specter of defeat that wouldn't go away, and I could finally see Downwell without feeling like a quitter. After that, I swore to myself that I would never play that game again, because of what I experienced with it and what it meant to me. So as you see, the intrusive thoughts of failure and inadequacy were a real burden on me, and it was my OCD that produced them. Downwell was the worst that obsessive compulsive disorder could ever put upon me, and I don't think there'll ever be another moment that'll match it. That game was a representation of my OCD, and that is why I can never see it in a positive light. That is why I hate Downwell. Obsessive compulsive disorder was not easy to overcome, and in truth, I never fully overcame it. It's something I continue to live with every day, but living with OCD or any mental illness shouldn't always be painful. I know that in my youth it was so much worse, but thanks to my family, my doctor, and my own resolve, I was able to keep it from ruling me. Obsessive compulsive disorder, as much as it's hurt me, has made me a stronger person. I can speak as someone who was able to admit that they needed help and got help from the people who love and support him. It took time, it took work, but OCD is my ordeal. It shows that I rose above something that kept me down, and in finishing Downwell, I realized that I could overcome OCD. It wasn't going to own me, and even with my continued coexistence with it, I refuse to let it do that.